Lesson 2.4, Turmoil over Taxes. In this lesson, we're going to look at the British colonies after the French and Indian War. Now, no longer will the French and the Spanish play a big part in these lessons. We're going to primarily focus on the British and their colonies. And that's because with the end of the French and Indian War, the British had essentially defeated the French, which meant that the French no longer had a major presence in North America. The problem is the British are left behind with huge amounts of taxes and burdens, and they have to kind of figure out how to pay for the war, but then also manage this brand new land that they just acquired after that war. Now, in order to kind of figure this out, it kind of helps to break things down a little bit. There's going to be some building tension throughout this lesson that's going to ultimately lead to the American Revolution. The first off is the use of mercantilism to control trade in the colonies, and we'll get more into that here in a little bit. Then you have this slogan, no taxation without representation, which is more or less a summary that the British never allowed the colonists to vote on laws that they had to follow, including what kind of taxes they paid. Then you have a series of laws and taxes that are viewed as unfair by the colonists, and then you see this British reaction when the colonists push back by smuggling or protesting in some way, shape, or form. Then the tension gets built even further. The colonists react. You have a protest in Boston that leads to what's called the Boston Massacre, where essentially a group of Bostonians, younger, are protesting the taxes in front of essentially a government building, and British soldiers open fire on these protesters, and it is seen as a horrible thing in the colonists. Later on, you have what's called the Boston Tea Party, where the taxes get so great that a group of men basically board a ship and throw, by modern day equivalents, millions of dollars worth of tea into the Boston harbor. And then you have the formation of the First Continental Congress, which was essentially a unified government for the colonists to make decisions, which is very illegal under British law and seen as very revolutionary. And then ultimately, this is all going to culminate in the American Revolution and the creation of the Declaration of Independence and the formation of the United States. So let's go ahead and dive in. So the first thing we got to kind of establish is this thing called the Navigation Acts and mercantilism. Whenever the British set up these colonies, the whole idea was the colonies were going to benefit Great Britain. That's their purpose. That's their lot. They're going to make Britain wealthy. The colonists saw it as a way of getting away from Britain and a way of getting freedom. So there's this weird dynamic going on where one thinks that the colonies exist for their benefit, and the colonies think that they exist more or less for their own independence. The British passed what's called the Navigation Acts, which controls the Atlantic Ocean and trade. Basically, the colonies have to trade with England. There is no other alternative. Now, to ensure that the British profited from this trade, they used a system of mercantilism to make sure that if the colonies produce any kind of raw materials or food or any kind of monetary wealth, gold or silver or otherwise, it must be served up almost on a silver platter to the mother country, in this case Britain, for their profit. This system is known as mercantilism because it's controlling merchants, or mercantilism, kind of where the word comes from. So any raw materials the colonies created must be sold to Great Britain. Any products the colonies need to buy must come from Great Britain, or the mother country. This means that Great Britain is always involved in the trade and always going to turn a profit. Now, mercantilism prevents the colonies from trading with one another. So even though North Carolina and South Carolina literally touch, they're not allowed to trade with one another, even if they could get a better deal by trading with each other. Instead, if North Carolina wanted to sell something to South Carolina, or I guess I should say if North Carolina wanted to buy something from South Carolina was going to have to first sell that to a company or a business in Great Britain, and then that company can then sell it to a person in the North Carolina colony. It's kind of redundant. It adds a lot of steps to the process, but what it does do is it ensures that whatever is being produced in the colony benefit Great Britain. Now, in order to pay off the French and Indian War, the British Parliament are also going to add taxes. So not only do you have the British controlling trade, but now the British are going to think, well, now we need to make sure that we can pay for the French and Indian War, which made these colonies safe to begin with, and we're going to raise taxes on them to more or less pay for the war. The colonies see this as a punishment, and they actually kind of saw the war as almost like Britain's desire to expand its empire and had nothing to do with the colonies. Now, what really became big in this time period was the slogan, no taxation without representation. There's some historical argument on whether or not the slogan itself was used in the phrase that we're talking about it now, but for the most part, we're going to kind of use it as a placeholder. Samuel Adams, which was actually one of the guys who organized the Boston Tea Party later on, said that if taxes are laid upon us or made that we have to pay them in any shape without having our legal representation or a vote, where they are laid, we are not reduced from character of free subjects to the miserable status of tributary slaves. In other words, if we have to pay taxes or follow laws that we don't have a voice on, we're essentially slaves. We don't have a voice. We don't have representation. Might have been the extreme statement, but I understand the sentiment. One of the first taxes that gets passed is actually called the Sugar Act, which taxed sugar and molasses. Now, the Sugar Act is a pretty big deal because back then everybody had to cook their food from home. And if you baked or if you made anything, you used sugar. Molasses was really popular when you produced a product like rum, which is alcohol, which was used primarily in the slave trade. So there's a lot of ties between the slave trade and the Sugar Act as well. The Sugar Act also angered a lot of the colonists because at this point, tea is very popular and tea with sugar is a very common thing to use. So sugar is a pretty high commodity. Plus, it's kind of one of the only forms of sweets you could have back then. So it had a high demand. Now, the next would be a Stamp Act. This taxed all legal documents, everything from marriage papers to wills, diplomas, newspapers, even playing cards had to have a stamp, similar to one that you see over here on the right-hand side, that red stamp. If it didn't have the stamp, you could be arrested, you could be fined, and you had to pay these things. And so you essentially couldn't even get married. You couldn't even die without having to have a stamp put on the official documents, the death certificate or the will. Later on, smuggling sugar and molasses became very popular. Creating counterfeit stamps obviously became popular as well. But this became very popular. It also frustrated the British, and so they would end up passing what's called a writ of a writ of assistance, which essentially is like a search warrant today, that allowed the British to essentially search ships at any point they wanted to. This really angered the colonists, some cases to the point where they would even tar and feather, which is actually kind of a death sentence, some of these tax collectors and enforcers. Now, the Quartering Act was passed in order to make sure that there was enough soldiers in the colonies to enforce these laws. This allowed soldiers to live in the homes of colonists. They had to pay for their housing, pay for their food, do their laundry, care for them, the whole 9 yards. And you didn't have a voice in it. You didn't get to volunteer for this. This was thrust upon you. Later on, a new set of taxes were passed that were called the Townshend Acts, which were named after Townshend, the guy who was the prime minister at the time. They taxed glass, paper, paint, lead, and tea. I mean, glass was used for everything, bottles, windows, everything that you had to have a container for. Paper, for the obvious reason, still with the Stamp Act. Paint, which sounds kind of redundant, but when you think if you're going to build something, you typically had to paint it to keep it from rotting. Lead, ammunition, and tea, which was essentially like it was the most popular drink of the day. That and coffee. Coffee was pretty high up there. And then probably alcohol. But for a non-alcoholic drink, tea and coffee were right up there. But to tax tea was a great slap in the face because it would kind of like be like having a major tax on essentially like bottled water today. And it would be kind of frustrating for some people. Now, all this would kind of come to a head on March 5th, 1770. A crowd of angry individuals, some of them pretty young, upper teenage years, 20s, 30s, some are older, showed up in front of the Boston Custom House, which is essentially where you paid taxes to. Kind of think of it like a courthouse, only designed specifically for paying taxes. They were protesting, shouting. Some of them were throwing snowballs, and some of the soldiers panicked, and they fired their muskets into the crowd, killing 5 unarmed colonists. One of the first individuals to die was actually Crispus Attucks, which was an African-American colonist at the time. This was just abhorred by the colonists. The colonists were absolutely outraged by this attack on members of the colonists who were protesting. Of course, the colonists would put a spin that it was like peaceful protesting, but there was probably some out of line comments and throwing of objects and things like that. But there's no record of necessarily anyone firing guns at the British. The British were the first ones to fire their muskets into this crowd, and the crowd, for the most part, from what we know of, was completely unarmed, probably with the exception of like sticks and rocks and clubs. Now, the colonists were outraged. There was all kinds of things posted out all over the colonies, lots of newspaper prints. It was very well read. Remember, the colonists were more likely to read and write, so they read these things quite frequently. And so the British, realizing, holy cow, these colonists are absolutely upset. We might have actually made a mistake here. It's not really enforceable. They repealed all the taxes except for tea. By 1770, nearly every colonist was brewing tea twice a day. It was the most popular drink, like I said, maybe with the exception of coffee. And at this point, I think tea was even more popular than coffee. The British government controlled the tea trade. They had a monopoly. They controlled every bit of the tea trade. The colonists decided to boycott tea as a form of protest. Like, we're just not going to buy it. And they had other forms of tea that they would make out of herbs and spices, kind of like if you bought Sleepy Time tea today, that they just kind of like, all right, fine, we're not going to buy it. This actually was really bad for the British because this was one of the most profitable items that they sold around the world. And now their colonists are not buying it, which meant it was essentially causing a slight recession back home. The British decided, okay, we're going to keep sending this tea, and we're essentially going to try and force the colonists to buy it. Well, the colonists wouldn't know nothing of it. And so on December 16th, 1773, Samuel Adams, the same guy that had that quote earlier about representation and slavery, formed an organization called the Sons of Liberty, dressed up as Mohawk Indians, who were almost completely extinct by this point, and boarded the ship holding this tea in Boston Harbor and threw 342 chests of tea into the harbor. It was a huge sum of money back then. And essentially, Boston was put in lockdown as a result because of this treatment. And so huge numbers of soldiers flooded into the city. Because of the intolerable acts which were passed by Parliament, that's the British lawmaking body, Massachusetts was being punished, as well as some of the other colonies, but it was mainly focused over Boston. It was getting really intense. The colonies were kind of getting upset, or at least some were. And even if the people weren't necessarily supporting the idea of independence, they were definitely getting upset about how these soldiers were being used to essentially enforce law and peace in these cities. People were being arrested, people were being imprisoned. It was getting pretty hairy pretty quick. Now, in September 1774, the leaders of the colonies decided to gather at Philadelphia for what's called the First Continental Congress. Congress being just a gathering of voting members who would voice their opinions. Eventually, it would become the name of our lawmaking branch of our government today. This was really revolutionary and seen as more or less illegal by the British government and denounced by them. But the colonists, they kept meeting. Some of the famous people we learn about, George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, were there, and they would essentially debate on how to respond. The delegates agreed to boycott all goods from Britain, which would have been like trying to boycott everything from China today. It would be a really big deal, and if done, if we boycotted China today, it would have a huge impact on their economy. And it was having a huge impact on the British economy whenever they decided to boycott Great Britain. In addition to this, each colony started training their own militia and basically readying themselves for war. Tensions were absolutely to an all-time high. And so it's going to be at this point, I'm going to kind of leave us here because now we know what is causing this tension in the colonies, what is leading to all this issues of frustration and anger towards the British. It revolves around the fact that they have to trade with the British. They have to pay taxes that they never got a vote on. They have to follow laws like the Quartering Act that they never got a say on. And now, whenever they do tend to protest, if something goes awry, they're even punished even further for it. And so they're left with the only choice of organizing and possibly putting together some type of resistance. Now, keep in mind, no colonists at this point, or I should say very few colonists at this point, are talking about independence or fighting a war. They still want to negotiate peace with the British. That's their goal. The idea of becoming a new country, I'm not saying it hasn't crossed some people's heads by 1774, but it is definitely not a popular view.